If Sunday school teachers tell kids to not ask questions, they shouldn't be surprised when those kids grow up to be atheists. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. Right now I'm still working on my little jungle exile settlement, and I'm going to be talking about Christians who have doubts about the faith. This was me at one time. Generally, I'm talking about people who want to be good Christians, who kind of want Christianity to be true, but are having more intellectual doubts about whether it's true. So I'm not really addressing people who actually want to leave Christianity. I'm talking about people who want to be good Christians but have trouble being convinced that it's actually true. So let me tell you guys a story. So I didn't grow up being like religious at all. I was pretty anti-religious. I thought religion was kind of anti-scientific because I've always had a more intellectual way of thinking about things. When I say I'm intellectual, it doesn't mean I'm smart. It just means I'm more intellectual than emotional with how I think through things. But my biggest barrier to Christianity growing up was the idea that it was anti-scientific. And once I met a lot of Christians in real life and saw how smart a lot of the Christians I met were, that really changed it for me. And there were a lot of other reasons I became Christian. I was also moved by how kind and loving the Christians I met were. And by the way, right now I'm building a farm for the food that I'm gonna eat around here. But yeah. For the first year of me being a Christian, I didn't think that much about intellectual challenges to the Christian faith. I was just excited to be a Christian. I was just on a conversion high. Because when you go from being not Christian to Christian, when you have a dramatic born-again experience like I did, it's very exciting. Now, not everyone has dramatic born-again experiences. For example, my fiancé has always been a Christian ever since she was baptized as a baby, which is what you're supposed to do, by the way. She's always been a Christian. She, unlike me, there's never a time she remembers when she was not a Christian, so she doesn't have one of these born-again experiences. Also, some people convert to Christianity, but it's more of a gradual process, and they can't point to any one moment where they converted, and that's fine. Those people shouldn't be made to feel like they're not true Christians because they didn't have some dramatic conversion. But I did have one of these dramatic conversions. So it was really exciting for me at first, being Christian. But after the excitement wore off, I began to question, is this stuff actually true? And I was going through some discouraging times in my life. You know, my PCUSA church, our pastor just retired, and he was being replaced by these temporary pastors, these old ladies who didn't seem to really care about the faith that much. Because, you know, that's when I started to learn my denomination has a bit of a theological liberalism problem, so I was feeling very discouraged. I began to ask myself, how do I know all this is actually true? And my doubts just came on suddenly like a storm. It was like one day I wasn't having any doubts about the faith. The next day I was like swamped in them. And I think that's the most existentially terrified I've ever been. Like, I've been scared of a lot of things throughout my life. My biggest fear, by the way, is actually getting the stomach virus. But the most existential dread I ever felt was that feeling that, what if this is not real? I thought to myself, everything I could potentially lose, I could live with. But I cannot live without God. That's what I thought to myself. So I was like, I need to somehow find out that this whole Christianity thing is true. So I was really panicked, and it was a rough few weeks when I started to wrestle with doubts, especially because I did not know which resources to turn to. I didn't know about Christian apologetics. I didn't know much theology at all. I barely ever read the Bible. So all I had was like Google searching proof that God is real, which obviously isn't going to give you many substantive results. And I listened to like whatever authorities I could find. I was getting into like conservative politics at that time. I'd been, you know, a progressive leftist most of my life, but at that time I had just started being more conservative. So I listened to people like Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro, hoping they could give me some reasons to believe God exists. Obviously, they did not give me the best information. They're not even Christian, they're Jewish. But at the end of the day, my doubts actually ended up helping me, because it was my doubts that inspired me to look for answers about the faith, and that's what inspired me to start studying theology. Right now, I'm known as that theology YouTuber, the YouTuber who always talks about nerdy theological concepts like supralapsarianism. But I had actually never read the Bible for like the first year of being Christian, nor had I read any theological works. I would think to myself about, you know, God and Christianity, but I was prideful. I thought I could figure it out all by myself. Once I had these doubts, I realized I couldn't do that. And that's what drove me to begin studying theology. So for about 6 months, I didn't go to the best places to learn theology, but eventually I found Reformed theology through Tim Keller, because I was Presbyterian. I knew he was a Presbyterian pastor as well. Tim Keller was my introduction to theology, and his sermons on the Bible were just so good that inspired me to read all of the Bible myself, which the following year I did. And the more I started studying theology, the less doubts that I had. So I guess my first piece of advice for anyone who's struggling with doubts is that your doubts are not necessarily a bad thing, and God can and will actually use them as a very good thing sometimes if it inspires you to study the faith. As St. Anselm is one of my favorite Christian theologians outside the Bible. I'd say Anselm is probably like my fourth favorite saint. And his famous quote is that theology is faith-seeking understanding. So when we have doubts about the faith, that drives us to seek to understand the faith better. So that's why we say theology is faith-seeking understanding. So usually it's that existential anxiety, it's that doubt that actually motivates us to go closer to God. So I would say, if you have doubts, don't be afraid of your doubts, just trust in God, and trust that if you trust in God, God will use your doubts towards something productive. And at the time, while this was happening, I didn't know that anything productive would come of my doubts until some of my friends started asking me questions about the faith. And I realized I was able to answer their questions because I had gone through this period of doubt and I had experienced the same questions they were experiencing. I noticed I was able to help out a lot of my friends with their struggles with faith. I thought to myself, what if I made a YouTube channel out of this? Now, there are other problems people have when they start doubting the faith, and a big one is they feel like they're not being a good Christian. They feel like they're not saved or whatever, especially people who grew up in, like, legalistic Baptist circles. Not all Baptists are like this, but there's some legalistic Baptist circles where any sort of intellectual doubt is seen as not just sin, but seen as evidence that you're not really saved. Because I have two friends. I have way more than two friends. No. There are two people I know who are friends that have different stories. I think they're an interesting case study. One of them is perfectly convinced of the supernatural, perfectly convinced of God and the supernatural. And he never goes to church, and he identifies as Christian, but clearly does not care about it at all. I've tried to bring him to church. He just never gets around to it, just does not care. But he's perfectly convinced of God and the supernatural. He has seen, like, spirits appearing in his room. He has no doubt that God exists. So it's not an issue of the intellect for him, it's an issue of the will. But he just doesn't care. Whereas I have another friend who really wants to be a Christian. His faith means everything to him. His faith gives him more joy than anything else. But he is a very scientific guy. He's a biology major, and he is just not intellectually certain that God exists, and he wants to believe in God. But oftentimes he has doubts and he goes through dark times where he feels like atheism might be correct. But he still really wants Christianity to be true, and he's the one who got baptized with me a couple years ago. So which of these two people do you think is being a more faithful Christian? I would say it's the second one, my friend who has intellectual doubts about the faith, but still really wants it to be true. So theologians, especially scholastic theologians, talk about the difference between the intellect and the will. So for friend number one, his intellect believes in God, but his will doesn't really want to submit to God. Whereas friend number two of mine, his will really does want to submit to God. He's always wants to go to church and stuff. His intellect isn't fully convinced of God right yet, but if he could find evidence, proof that God exists, I'm sure he would. So now let's get into some actual resources for mitigating doubts. So I'm not here to address every single possible intellectual doubt about the faith, because there's no way I could do that in 20 minutes. There's one time I tried to address every atheist argument in 20 minutes, and if you guys know how that went, you know that probably wasn't the best decision I ever made. But I can point you guys to some good resources. So for me, like I said, Tim Keller was very, very helpful. He was my introduction to theology. His book, Reason for God, is amazing. If you guys don't want to buy it, he has like just lectures about it, which cover a lot of the content, but the book itself is really good. It's like, that is the first book I recommend to beginners to Christianity because of how helpful it was for me as a teenager. There's a lot of specific things, like mostly these are things that you'll encounter on Reddit, like someone saying, oh, did you know the story of Jesus was copied from the story of Horus and Dionysus or whatever? Now, actual atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman know that this is ridiculous, and no serious atheist will say that. Like Alex O'Connor, in his reaction to my video, admits that those Jesus mythicism stories are complete bogus. But a lot of times, young Christians going on Reddit, they don't know that, so they actually feel threatened when they hear things like that. So Inspiring Philosophy has a lot of videos addressing in detail every like historical or scholarly objection to the faith. He defends the existence of, Moses and Abraham. He defends the actual legitimate authorship of the Gospels, all those specific doubts. So if you have like sort of philosophical existential doubts about the faith, I would recommend Tim Keller. If you have just detailed historical doubts about the faith, I would recommend Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. And there's different arguments for God's existence, like if you favor a more evidential argument, you might want to read a lot of scholastic theologians based on that, like Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, not just his Summa Theologica, but Summa Contra Gentiles, I think is the most clear exposition of his argument for God, which, I can't find any flaws with it. My only complaint is that it kind of presupposes Aristotelian metaphysics. If you want a more transcendental argument for God, I might recommend J. Dyer, or, there's other people who articulate it, but he does it most clearly. But now I'll address some of the existential concerns about doubt, because at the end of the day, you need to go beyond what you can be intellectually certain of. I don't think we can be 100% intellectually certain about Christianity. I do believe that using mathematics, you can be 100% intellectually certain about God, and I am 100% intellectually certain that God exists, but specifically Christianity. There is a leap of faith, and faith doesn't contradict reason or evidence. Faith simply goes beyond evidence. For example, you can't scientifically prove that your wife loves you. You could be 99% sure, but if you tried to do a brain scan of her to prove that, she would get kind of annoyed at you because she would feel like you're not being faithful to her, that you don't actually trust her. So there is an existential aspect of it, and me being in high school struggling with all these doubts, it was a very existential time for me, because all the voices all around me in my leftist, progressive, atheist high school, all the voices around me, I'm not talking about voices in my head, people around me were telling me to not be Christian. And there was pressure throughout the culture to just, do drugs, sleep around, and not really save yourself for marriage like I was trying to do. People were telling me, oh, don't wait to date a Christian girl. You should just date whatever, Jewish or atheist girl you can find, because you're probably not going to find anyone otherwise. So, for me to not only intellectually believe the Christian faith, but for me to actually follow Christian morals when the world was pressuring me not to, that was a tough existential decision for me. And Kierkegaard is very helpful for this, Christian existentialism, because he says, yes, it is good that we have evidence of the Christian faith. For example, there's a lot of evidence that the resurrection of Jesus is a historical fact. I believe it is a historical fact. I think you can use history to prove the resurrection. But what Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say is that you should still be a Christian even if hypothetically you lived in a world where the evidence did not point towards Christianity. And for a while, I did live in that world. I did live in a world where the evidence that was available to me didn't exactly point to Christianity. Why? Well, because I grew up in a leftist public school that taught me a lot of lies, but at that time I didn't know it was lies. So I grew up in a school that taught me Christianity has always been the bad guy's religion throughout all of history. I was under the impression that Christianity had done far more harm than good throughout history. The school would milk things like the Crusades and give a lot of historical inaccuracies about the Crusades and really focus on the bad things the church did and never mention any of the many, many good things the church did. So I was living under the impression that Christianity was anti-science, that the church tortured Galileo for doing science, that Christianity has been the violent white man's colonizer religion. I was living under that impression, and I still had faith in Christianity because of the beauty that I saw in it, even though a lot of the evidence I was presented with was against it. And I'm not saying I'm this sort of, Christian Ubermensch or something, because I've still sinned many times in high school. A lot of the problems I had in high school were due to me being a Christian, but a lot of times it was just I was, a bad friend to a lot of people. I lost some of my friends due to my beliefs, but I also lost friends due to my own sin. So I wasn't this, Christian superhero or something. But I had to still be faithful to Christianity when I was not intellectually certain of it. So in high school, like I said, I mentioned, dating. Dating is a thing that a lot of high schoolers really have to deal with. Everyone around me was pressuring me, you shouldn't only date Christian girls because there were no Christian girls where I was. So there was a lot of pressure to just date some Jewish or secular girl because that's what the majority of the population around me was. But it was a tough existential decision for me. But at the end of the day, I decided I'm going to be faithful to what the Bible says, even if everyone around me tells me not to trust the Bible. And what happened? Once the pandemic started, I met my fiance, even though I had to go over 1,000 miles away to find her. And for me, that personal experience, there's also a ton of coincidences with how I met my fiance. I have a video about that. That was sort of like a validation from God, like a personal message from God, based on his providence, not like I heard any sort of audible voice, but just a personal message saying that it's good to trust in God. It's, as the Psalm says, it's better to trust in God than to trust in mankind. So I guess my final word for those having existential doubts about the faith is, even if it seems like it's hard to believe, what matters is that your will is oriented towards God, even if your intellect maybe isn't. Even if it's hard for you to believe. If you trust in God, despite the fact that your intellect seems unconvinced, that is the greatest act of faith, and that will inspire you, that will drive you to be a much more faithful Christian. So thanks for watching this, and I will see you guys later.